right, hi everyone, and we're back for part three of the Scrum Guide, again with Andrei and Gareth, and we'll pick up exactly where we left off. So, going on to the Scrum Events. Now, what I'd like to first of all ask, you guys have a lot more experience than me, but also I've been doing quite a bit of research when it comes to the criticism that people have against Scrum. It at least from what I've heard, it's usually towards the event that it's there to make it more palatable for management, to make it more effectively easier to well to almost give a sense of control to management than all the events happening, especially kind of at the same time, at the same place, as opposed to other agile frameworks like XP, where, from what I've again heard, would talk to developers that work in XP, that they just happen, type of retrospective type of meetings happen when they need to. Just as soon as they hit a problem, they would do them. So, in your experience, was that a valid criticism?
I've never heard that as a criticism, to be honest.
No.
Um, I don't know why.
No, that's
maybe
fine.
maybe I've just been in places where there's been a really good positive attitude or adoption by management or by the whole organization to ways of agile.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the real value in having a regular cadence in Scrum events is those short feedback loops.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I guess if management are on board with that, fantastic. And if they're not, that's the job of the Scrum Master, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Effectively, yes. So, all right. So that's fair enough. It's a few kind of, especially lectures that I found online and interviews with some more experienced agile coaches. I guess I could pull up for a few names, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily important. But those were just the, I guess they stuck with me because I've never heard them before, as like yourself. And whenever I heard them, it's like, okay, then maybe it makes sense that it's just a way of keeping track of things, but it doesn't. I've never thought of it whenever I've put it in that, applied it.
Maybe we'll touch on that when we get to the sprint review, because I think that's the one event that has maybe a tendency or has the risk of running into that kind of clash with management.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat as Garrett. That's why I'm silent. So I've got nothing really to add right now. So I think let's go through the events, and then we may end up tackling it without even wanting to.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Uh, Quite a lot to cover here. So first of all, this is something that I've used more frequent than I thought I would. Calling sprints the heartbeat of Scrum. That's a good metaphor, and I've used it as well. So it's true, at least where I stand. And also the fact that the focus is on value, so that turning ideas into value. And there, throughout the Scrum Guide, there's an emphasis on value, not just software delivered, for example. It's value. All right, now moving on. Usually, there's a lot of conversations around sprints. I mean, I actually worked at a company where there were conversations within different teams of what happens between sprints, and I know for a fact that there are companies that have teams that have a day between sprints, and that day is basically used for review, planning, all sorts of activities like estimate and all sorts of stuff. Judging by Gareth's reaction, I don't think he encountered that. And personally, I found no value to the extra day that was added between sprints, because usually they would start work as it is anyway. So what do you guys think? Like, just looking from outside, if you haven't encountered it, do you think there's any value in this?
No.
No, absolutely not.
First sentence of the section about Scrum events: the sprint is a container for all other events. So
Good point.
they might say that they're outside of this sprint. They're not. If those events haven't happened in the sprint and they're happening in that day between sprints, that day between sprints is in the previous sprint.
Trying to create these days between sprints, I think, can build bad habits. You're not being agile. You're supposed to fix things while still moving forward. So having a pause where you got to simply stop to try to fix something means that you haven't been doing it properly when you're supposed to be doing it. So it's not Scrum. It's not agile enough. It's not start the sprint and fix whatever needs to be fixed while you're moving forward, while you're delivering value.
It's like pausing the clock in the 7th lap of a 800 meters or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're cheating the system. You're not actually achieving anything.
All right.
Yeah.
Quite quite element.
That's what I say.
But yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I think the reason for it is because it gave the client a feel that throughout the work sprint, work would happen, and then you have like one day where all the rest of the things are kind of inserted, which kind of gives a false sense of what the team is doing. It almost feels like the events, well, the bigger ones like retro, planning, review, they're almost outside of the sprint. So, all right, no point in staying too long on that one.
That's fine. I just one point on here. The main thing that I came across a lot of people going is like, no changes are made that would endanger the sprint goal. A lot of people just read no changes are made and then stop right there, and basically would really kind of stress that the sprint cannot change for anything, for any reason ever, which again is a trap that you can fall into. Or that they don't take it enough seriously enough that they set a sprint goal, create a sprint plan and a sprint backlog, and then as soon as management or stakeholder, whoever asks, oh, by the way, I want this, okay, everybody stop what you're doing, we're doing this, because that's what we've been asked to do. Again, it's kind of two extremes, but two relatively easy, I think, traps to fall into.
You know what I've encountered, and this is actually a dangerous practice, because if you're not good at setting the sprint goal, I did have teams where during the sprint planning together with the PO, they would grab as many stories as they think they can handle for the next sprint, and then they would look at the stories, and based off of the stories, they would try to come up with a sprint goal that makes sense. Now, by doing that, when you're mid-sprint and you will have that negotiation, if you want to swap a few stories, like if there's something more important, perhaps there's a few issues that need to be tackled, then that inevitably ends up affecting the sprint goal. So one thing which is important here is to work on establishing a sprint goal, to do it properly, to do it well. And I think that's a hard thing to do. because there's no prescription to how to best establish sprint goals. So any thoughts or opinions on that?
Specific sprint goals. So many teams I've worked with have a very vague sprint goal, like begin work on feature X.
Exactly.
And I mean, they only really have to open the ticket to achieve that sprint goal. Do you know what I mean? And I kind of often go to the world of sport to give them, if you're playing rugby, for example. I grew up in the Scottish border, so rugby was the thing. A try scored when the attacking player is the first to ground the ball in the opponent's in-goal area. There's a very specific definition of what they need to do. It's not, get the ball to the other end of the pitch or play in a northerly direction, depending on which pitch they're playing in. Do you know what I mean? There's a very specific thing that you can measure and say, this, we've achieved this. And I think the other thing about sprint goals is, especially with teams that are new to Scrum, it's okay to start with a fairly easy sprint goal. If you've got a 2-week sprint, for example, it's okay to have a sprint goal that you will achieve in the first week, the first 4 days, whatever, because that then gives the team that kind of sense of achievement and the dopamine hit and the and they've actually achieved something that's of value, and then build up from there. It's okay to do that. And I've worked with a few teams where I've suggested that, and they're like, but that sounds like cheating. Like, who are you cheating? You're developing value. You're achieving. You're learning the moves. You're learning what we need to do. Start easy. But be specific.
The situation I was in, where we had a very vague sprint goal, or I guess not even a sprint goal, specific sprint goal that anybody could tell you towards the beginning when the whole team was new, was at the same time the product goal was very vague and the product backlog was jumbled up. There was no real sense to it as well, and that's kind of where it came from. We didn't know where we needed to end up roughly in how many sprints. So I think it's and we realized that exactly in the sprint review, the moment where we had a few user stories from different features. Basically, we started working on a few things at the same time, and when we had to present the work that we've done, it was, well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. In the review, we actually felt really awkward that it was like, okay, we don't have anything that concrete to kind of go a big ta-da at the end. So that's, I think, where we realized that right at the beginning that we fell into the trap of not having a clear sprint goal.
What are your thoughts on multiple sprint goals?
There's nothing explicitly against it, but you have to be very, very careful with those.
I mean, you would be pulling in too many directions, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's the same with OKRs, I think, because if you have too many OKRs, you would know what you're going after. And then even during the daily Scrum, normally you inspect how much closer you get towards the sprint goal or what are the risks. I think narrowing the sprint goal, or if you have more than one sprint goal, perhaps one suggestion would be to reduce the length of your sprints so you can do a weekly sprint and it's more focused. And by having that focus and limiting that work in progress, you may end up actually being faster at delivering value.
I agree. And the Scrum Guide does say the sprint goal. It never talks about multiple goals. In the way, a game of rugby, the goal is to win, is to get the most points. Now, there's different ways you could do that: try, drop goal, penalty, conversion. But the end result is always the same.
No, that's fair enough, and that's a very good point. Actually, the way what Andrei kind of just said is, if you do have more than one sprint goal, then your sprint is too long. Just shorten it and make it 2 sprints, one sprint for each goal.
I think one thing we want to discuss, because I stopped using burn downs or burn ups or even velocity. So I guess the question is anyone still using them? Do you find them useful?
Yes and no.
That sounds perfect.
It depends.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to comment on velocity, and that is, I've only used it when we rehearsed, kind of right at the beginning, practicing Scrum, and it was just part of the practicing. But as soon as we got into practice, I've never ever used it.
It's a tough thing to use, velocity, because it's a dangerous thing, because if it becomes more publicly known in terms of management understands that velocity is something that you surely can deliver, then the initial thought is, let's increase that velocity to make you more productive.
Mm-hmm.
Or that velocity means that basically you will be doing that every time. So if you got a 50-point velocity, then that's it. You're doing 50 points. So it's not necessarily math. That's the thing, and it varies. That's why you usually look at the last 3 or 5 sprints when you try to measure velocity as much as you can. And then there's the other thing that also happens with the velocity is during the sprint planning, the team has if you're relying too much on velocity, the team has the tendency to fill up all of the points. So even if some estimates may be off, they have, like, if you're doing a 50-point velocity and you've picked 40 points in the sprint, you want to get 10 more points, even though the initial, I don't know, ideal is that perhaps we have enough. You want to fill up those extra 10 points.
Are we assuming here that people understand what velocity means?
Well, that's a good question.
So so our user stories, the engineers that are going to be working on it assign what are called story points to that. So it's basically kind of an estimate of the complexity and the size and the risk that's still included in that story, that piece of work. And then what has traditionally happened is that they pull in a certain amount of stories and they add up those numbers, the story points, and that gives you your velocity, or your the size of how much work you can include in a sprint, and historically that's been used to then predict how much work will be done in future sprints. The problem with story points and velocity is the guy that invented them, Ron Jeffries, has since apologized and said they don't work. And they are essentially just a number, either just a number that's been plucked out of a team's head, or they are simply an indication of the team's capacity. And the way that people, a lot of agilists, are measuring things now. There's a guy, Daniel S. Vicanti, who's doing a lot of good work in this from the kind of Kanban side, looking at flow metrics such as throughput. That's how many user stories does a team complete in a sprint. Cycle time, how long does it take for something to go from to do to done? Keeping an eye on work in progress limits, so just making sure that the team's not working on too much at the same time. A bit like, if you put too many cars on the road, the traffic slows down. and also work age items. So how long is a piece of work in a particular status? So has it been in progress for too long, or is it in a QA status for too long? You can identify bottlenecks. And the general advice that I was given when I started looking into this was the best way for a team to work out how long it takes to do something is to measure how long that team takes to do something. And I started collecting that data quite a few months ago, 9-10 months ago, and it's been fascinating. So you can actually see, if a team estimates something as a 3 or a 5 or whatever, you would expect that if you follow the theory of that, you'd expect things to take roughly the same time. It's been wild when you actually see things. I found, a 3 could take one team, for example, anywhere between 1 day and 50 days, and a 5 anywhere from 3 days to 50 days. It's as kind of wild as that it's been. So velocity. Stay away from it, kids. The thing is, though, I do find value in estimating still, because the real value I find is that it gets the team talking about stuff. So if one team member says, "Oh, this is a 2," and another person says, "Oh, this is a 13," because they quite often use Fibonacci sequence, it allows you to kind of dig into why do you think it's a 13? What complexity are you seeing that we aren't? Or if you see it as a 2, quite the opposite. Why do you think it's so easy? That for me is the real value. Sorry for my lecture.
No, absolutely fair enough. Very, very useful insight.
Yeah. Plus, I've got the same opinion because I just got a team now, and they're gonna start using story points, which I actually stopped using in most of my teams. But their main concern was, we're not used to estimating, and what if we get it wrong, and just the regular concerns when you pick up story points. And I keep mentioning, we don't really care about the estimate. We want to have that discussion, because that discussion is exactly why we're here, like why we're doing the whole session of story pointing things. And then at some point, we're just going to drop the story points and then keep having those discussions.
Yeah.
All right.
Sprint planning.
This is a big one. This is the one meeting that everyone is super scared of, because I usually book longer than one would expect. So I'm not even, it says up to 8 hours for a 1 month sprint. And then if you kind of half that, for 2 week sprint, you're getting 4 hours as a recommended value. Now, I'm usually doing 2 week sprints. If I'm booking a 4 hour call, the team will get scared for some reason. It's a big commitment. So usually I go for 2 hours, or if I know we will need the time, it's going to be either 2.5 or 3 hours. So what are your thoughts on this, or what have you encountered so far? Are you on the same page or completely the opposite?
I worked with a team 2-week sprints, 4 to 5 hour planning regularly, and that was at their request eventually, when they saw the real value that came out of it. But those were in person. We were in the same room to start with. It's also important. A lot of, certainly where we're working on, everything's online. The whole of the sprint planning doesn't have to be everybody in one call. Once we've done the why is this important? What's the value? Once we've done the what, and kind of pulling things into a proposed backlog, the how can be done offline. either individuals kind of breaking stuff down, or working in pairs, or working as however they want to do it, with QA engineers or designers or whatever, kind of flitting between groups to work with these things. But I think if a team's going to do that, I think it's, and certainly in my experience, it's useful for the whole team to come back together at the end of that, say at a particular time, and just kind of run through the plan, so the team's got an idea of what's the big picture, what are we aiming to do, and do people think it's feasible? Do we need to redefine the sprint goal, finalize that before the end of sprint? I think that's how I would kind of see it ideally. I think in my experience, what a lot of teams, certainly early teams, do is they focus very much on the what. The why only really arrived, I think, in this latest version of the Scrum Guide. It used to just be what and how, and the team went, oh, here's what we're going to do. How are we going to do it? Oh, we know, we're developers, we understand this sort of thing, and they fail to really make the best use of that time, to their detriment.
Yeah, in my experience, I work with a lot of people that are very new to Scrum and Agile, and similar experiences. If I book long meetings, they get kind of intimidated, they get uncomfortable. So what I've done is I pretty much facilitate that meeting by just book an open-ended half an hour meeting, and I don't let it go past. Usually it ends up by the 2.5 to 3 hour mark for a 2-week sprint. In our case, it was also because the team is new, we're a little bit more modest towards what we can deliver, so we don't pick that many user stories. We're slowly building velocity to kind of bring velocity back into it. But although we're not measuring velocity, we're just seeing the results at the end of the review. But I've tried at the beginning booking pretty much what seems like half a day just for the sprint planning, and everybody gets terrified. Yeah, it's they feel like, oh, it's an examination. What they're just gonna not survive that meeting. It's I'm not. It just looks exhausting looking at the calendar and just seeing a big blob that takes half a day.
It is, especially in the remote setting where sometimes I feel like I'm nonstop in calls. I do have days where like 7 hours I'm continuously in various calls, and it gets scary just to see a big one that's on there for like 4 hours. One thing I would also mention is my dog is barking. First of all, is I love the fact that well, we're introduced to the sprint backlog and the product backlog, and I like that there's a difference. There's a clear difference, and I wasn't before. I wasn't paying attention to it. It was kind of the same thing to me. Now that I keep mentioning sprint backlog to the team, and make sure that they understand that sprint backlog is your responsibility. As a team, whatever you're putting into the sprint backlog, that's your baby. That's your responsibility. If anyone wants to put something in there, they have to go and ask you, where the negotiation also comes in. But the sprint backlog is basically you saying, these items, these are our responsibility. Our promise is that we're going to turn this into an increment, a valuable increment, and this is just ours. So it's important to have that distinction, because that increases a team's commitment to it. And I keep repeating that to my teams. This is the sprint backlog. This is your sprint backlog. And when we get to the daily Scrum, we will also look at how the team contributes to the sprint backlog rather than what I've done yesterday. But I don't want to spoil. So let's keep on the let's keep on the planning.
I like your strategy though, Vlad, about the team pulling in as little as possible to meet the sprint goal, because I think that's also my experience, is that teams will tend to pull in far more than they can actually achieve. Human beings are terrible at estimating things, and if we estimate things for ourselves, how much work I think I could do in a day, I will generally overestimate. And what I found is if you ask somebody else how much someone else could achieve, people will tend to underestimate. So we think more of ourselves than other people. So that's a good way to try and get that balance in sprint planning as well. How much do you think someone else could do?
No, absolutely, and it's in the reviews, the sprint reviews, that you kind of realize that I take too much or too little. At least in my experience, it's I think maybe once that with my team that we realized, okay, we probably could have taken a little bit more during the last sprint, but usually it's just the velocity does increase, and again, I don't measure it, but it's just noticeable in the review. But that increases just because the team works better and better together as the sprints kind of move forward. So by starting with something very small, it's almost like focusing on team building in the first at the same time as delivering something of value during the first few sprints.
Yeah, I think that's right. That encouraging the team to stretch themselves is a good thing, but don't overburden them. If they've got this huge backlog of stuff that they're feeling, oh, we've got to get through all of this in the next 2 weeks, that's when they start to. That's when people start to cut corners and the quality, decreases, and then things take longer.
Question: what about the opposite? Did you ever encounter, or did you ever have a sprint planning where you basically had work for the first few days, 4 or 5 days of the sprint, and then just started off and then keep adding as the sprint progressed?
Yes, but that was a very strange situation in which the company, for a brief moment, went through the genius idea of, we're going to try implementing SAFe. So everybody's sprints have to be the exact same size and have to start the exact same time. And then after one sprint, it was like, yeah, okay, everybody just do what you do best. Just forget that idea.
I have, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. We were making decisions at the latest responsible moment, so we knew what we needed to achieve in the first 3 days. And it's worth remembering too. Scrum has this rugby analogy. There's only one ball in a game of rugby. The team's only using one ball at one time. So, focus on one thing at a time. Get it across the line.
So when I started doing Scrum, when I started working as a QA engineer, and we were working in the Scrum framework, I was never nobody told me to go read the Scrum guide, and I was just doing what everyone else did in the team. And the one thing everyone else did in the team was answer 3 questions. And that's what I understood I need to do. Answer what I did yesterday, what I'm working on right now, and if there's any blockers. Which easily turned into a reports meeting because we've just said progress. We've never actually discussed opportunities, or we never used the daily Scrum for a mini planning session, which I end up calling it occasionally. So the one thing which the guide clearly states, and I just want to point it out, I guess, is the daily Scrum focuses on progress toward the sprint goal. So feel free to answer those questions if your team is comfortable answering them, but refer to the sprint goal within each of those questions. So what I'm doing right now is helping us contribute towards the sprint goal. Do I have anything that's blocking me towards achieving the sprint goal, or are we one step closer to achieving it, or is it at risk, the sprint goal? So work around the sprint goal more if you're asking those questions. Although, yeah, for a while now, my teams have stopped answering those questions, and we tend to walk the board, and we tend to look at items that are more, I guess, dangerous, that take more time, and that have become more complex since we started. So yeah, that was just the thing that I wanted to get off my chest. You're on mute, Gareth, which is something we keep saying in the online world. You're on mute.
Sorry. What, for those that don't know, what does walking the board mean in practice?
Good question. So walking the board, usually how we do it, you have a Jira board, for example, and then walking the board goes from right to left. Right being the ones that are closest to done, and then left is basically just started development on them. Right to left and up down, so from top to bottom. Basically that means you're covering the tickets that are closest to being done, and you're discussing what you still need to do to get them over the finish line. And then as you progress towards the left, you start discussing any tickets that have just started development right now, and if there's any blockers on those ones. And at the end, you finish with parking lots.
The reason being that we want to get the in-progress work completed before starting new work. As somebody once said to me, you cannot ship in progress. So we're actually wanting to achieve that value. So if we focus on the stuff that's nearest done and get that over the line, then we can start pulling in other things, which also helps raise questions about priority. Because if we've got the stuff over the line that's actually not the highest priority stuff in a sprint, there's a good opportunity for some conversations.
Another, I think this is kind of a wider misunderstanding of the daily Scrum, that it says that if the product owner or the Scrum Master are actively working on items in the sprint backlog, they participate as developers. Otherwise, they don't need to participate. And the Scrum Master doesn't need to actually actively facilitate the daily Scrum. I fell into that trap, although it's a bit of a strange situation, which I don't think it could work otherwise, because I'm in a situation where I'm almost training people to work in Agile, so the staff turnover, as it were, is so high that every other week we're getting new people into the Scrum team just to get them used to working in Agile. And without help, a little bit of facilitation, that it's hard to kind of get them, definitely, especially from day one, to participate in the daily Scrum. But what I've also noticed, just going through job postings everywhere, companies expect the Scrum Master to facilitate the daily Scrum, which is you understand where that misunderstanding then comes from for the Scrum Masters, especially if you're not an experienced Scrum Master.
Yeah, and I think that's, what is it, medical students when they're in hospitals, they watch one, do one, teach one. And I've kind of used that with teams as well, is I'll facilitate it this week. You watch how I do things. Next week, someone else does it. And then you teach it to the next person and keep going.
No, that's okay. That's a good technique to kind of get developers to teach each other.
Yeah, I use Wheel of Names. Basically, you put all names from each team member on a wheel and then just spin it. And then whoever's the lucky winner gets to facilitate that day. And it's true. I mean, all job postings basically insinuate that you need to facilitate all Scrum events and that you're responsible for all Scrum events. But in reality, the daily Scrum, for example, because we're on it, belongs to the developers. The Scrum Master should be there if requested or if needed, because it may not be requested, but still needed. And same goes for the product owner, which, again, this is something that I've had struggles with, because product owner coming in sometimes turns into a reports meeting.
And presumably the reason that's in so many job descriptions is that they haven't listened to this podcast.
We'll see if we can make a dent in it.
Moving on to the sprint review.
So this is one event which I think ends up being either the most hated or the most misunderstood. And I'm glad everyone agrees. I don't think we'll be having a lot of debates. However, is there any tips and tricks that you want to recommend for having a nice sprint review or a pleasant sprint review?
Don't call it a demo.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I love that one.
I think if it turns into that Scrum team should avoid limiting it to a presentation. If it turns into something that is driven entirely by PowerPoint, then you're probably in a real pickle. I got a reputation at my last job because it was the responsibility of the Scrum Master for some reason to run the sprint review, when actually I think it's probably more the domain of the product owner, because we're talking about largely the input is, the sprint backlog, the product backlog, the sprint backlog, what have we achieved, and the outcome is is how's the product backlog affected, and the direction of the product is affected. I had a reputation for not running it on, or not basing it entirely on PowerPoint. I still had to do one, unfortunately, but I turned it into a conversation between the development team and the stakeholders. So we actually had like the head of the department, or the head of the unit, who was there, and him actually asking the developers directly, what happened here? What can I do to help fix things, to make this smoother? What are your real problems? Getting the developers actually, hearing from key stakeholders and users, these are the problems that we're having, this is what we're trying to achieve, was invaluable. So actually try to create a conversation rather than a presentation. So it's a two-way thing, not just a broadcast of, we have achieved this, look how amazing we are. Try to make it a safe space, where the developers can just put their hands up and go, do you know this? We messed up. We didn't do well here, or this was easy. These were the problems that we encountered. Help.
This is something also I word it differently, is I tell people to try to make this informal, because this tends to be the most formal meeting of all, and it shouldn't, because that limits the transparency quite a lot.
Yeah, and it especially should be focused on feedback. The one thing that I try to tell my team is, ask the stakeholders questions, ask the people that it's not a presentation, not an examination. You're not being scored on what you work you've done. If you want to know where you want to head to next, ask them questions. It's almost turn the spotlight around towards them, as like, what do you want, what do you need, what do you think of the work that we've done so far. It does a lot of times that just feel like it's people join the meeting with, if they're the stakeholders or from client side, thinking they're just going to sit back, watch something nice, and kind of give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and that's it. But it needs to be about feedback if it's to be valuable. Otherwise, it's just for show.
I think you're right, and that there should not be an expectation that we get things right first time. For a framework that's based on I can't speak today. For a framework that's based on empiricism and trying things out and learning from what we do, there's still, when we get to the sprint review, we've maybe not achieved something, or we tried something and it didn't work, but there's still a kind of sense of judgment of, oh, come on, we need this out as quickly as possible. The team has learned something, and sharing that with the stakeholders is hugely valuable, because then we all learn and we all grow and we all know which direction we're going in, or we know which direction we're not going in now. 4 hours though for a sprint review. Who's ever been in one of those?
I mean, mine are usually 1 hour long by default. I'm not even booking anything more.
We usually start with booking, and it's not at the request of kind of stakeholders, half an hour meetings, and they end up going to about 45 minutes to an hour. All right, the sprint retrospective.
I think there's one important thing that's not spelled out here, but it's hinted at, and that is the logical order of the events at the end of the sprint. So you have the sprint review, which may affect the sprint, the product backlog. You then have the sprint retrospective, when the whole Scrum team gets together. They may bring things that they've learned from the sprint review into that, which may influence how they then change the way that they work. And they take those lessons into sprint planning, but potentially taking some of the actions that come out of sprint retrospective into sprint planning. And I've been working with a team where we've recently realigned with the Scrum guide as to the order of events. And it's I'm certainly finding it really helpful. And I think it's been quite a good experiment, seeing those events in the wrong order. So they would have like sprint planning, and then the review, and then the retro after the next sprint had started, and it just felt so wrong. We weren't learning things in the right order. We weren't kind of building on that learning.
Yeah, I think one more thing I want to add is this perhaps is this one relies heaviest on the Scrum Master to do his job properly, or her job properly, sorry. So more often than not, you need to make sure that this is facilitated well enough so that there is transparency, so that your teammates are open and then they can discuss problems, but also that there's trust. Because I think I'm sure a lot of us and a lot of listeners have encountered this, but I did have quite a few sprint retrospectives where everyone was silent, and perhaps you just had a few of it went well, that yeah, we communicated and we were able to deliver whatever this sprint, and you just scratch the surface. You don't really get deeper into the actual problems. So this is a meeting this is an event that I think it needs to be heavily facilitated sometimes. Any ways, I guess, from experience that we can help make it better?
Yes.
Do tell.
I think recognizing that people, have different senses of openness and confidence when speaking in front of others. I've certainly found using post-it notes or electronic equivalent, other sticky note manufacturers are available. Allows the more kind of introverted and quiet folks to put their ideas down, and for them, not to be, not feeling that they need to speak out. The facilitator can draw that out with them later. Yeah, I speak as an introvert.
What about changing the format of the sprint retro? So a lot of teams use a typical format like start doing, stop doing, keep doing, or what we've learned, or what dragged us down, or there's all sorts of formats online. Do you perhaps find value in occasionally changing it or changing it more often? Or any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I do. It kind of depends on what's been going on in the sprint. There was one team that I was working with not that long ago where we were focusing very much on the flow of the team and trying to speed things up, but identify where were our bottlenecks. And I was normally doing like a 6 category kind of, what have we liked, what have we enjoyed, what's we found puzzling, start, stop, continue, that kind of thing. And for that one, I used like engines and anchors. What's speeded us up? What were the engines? What slowed us down? And just having that focus, that distinctive focus on just those two things, was really quite useful. And one of the bits of feedback from that retrospective was that they still wanted a box that they could put things on. What did they call it? Like gripes or things that they could just complain about. I hated this. There's a framework, the modern Agile Framework, which I found really useful, which is about a focus on making people awesome, make safety a prerequisite, experiment and learn rapidly, and deliver value continuously. And I've used those 4 categories as a really useful way to help focus the team on those things. What are we doing well in each of these categories? What are we not doing well? So I brought that in when the team had kind of got to a certain point of maturity and safety with each other. And I just brought that in just to kind of help the team reflect on, what are we actively doing in these areas. But for the most part, I tend to there's about 3 different models that I use, or 3 different exercises that I kind of rotate depending on what's going on.
Just on this, there's a coach called Chris Stone from Virtually Agile. He posts so many different retro formats on LinkedIn, and I happen to look through them occasionally because I find them quite interesting, and I do like them. So for anyone who wants to try new things, I mean, he's usually working off a mirror board, I think, but his formats, some of them are quite good, and they're movie themed and whatever. But just asking those questions in different ways may help your team. So just a bit of a mention there for Chris, because I think he's doing a great job.
There's a website called Retromat, retromat.org, which has a whole bunch of different suggestions for the different stages of a retro. The setting the stage, gathering data, generating insights, deciding what to do, closing the retrospective, and there's loads of different exercises or different models, which I've used in the past. It's, you know, when I've kind of got to that point where I'm thinking, what am I going to do? There's a kind of a random retro generator on that, and you just click a button and it'll give you the whole structure of your retro.
That's useful. I'll put these links in the description for the video, just so people find it easier.
One more thing I want to mention about retros before we even think moving on is make sure those discussions are not in vain. So make sure there's follow-up, make sure there's actions at the end, and make sure everyone knows who's responsible for those actions, because just by having that conversation, that may be just half of the battle. And people may be open and they may share their problems, but if nothing happens, then that goes nowhere and you haven't done much. So it's even in the Scrum guide, you have to adapt. So once you find the issues, once you find whatever's dragging you down or whatever that can be improved, make sure you act on it. So just wanted to mention that and make it as clear as possible.
That's a good point. And I think part of, I always try to include at the start, as part of the introduction to the retrospective, looking back at past actions to look at what have we achieved. We've said we're going to do this. Have we done it? What do we still have to do? And I once did that with a team, and we had 21 outstanding retrospective actions. It was just a list of, it's like a wish list of, that'd be nice. So actually, I at that point just immediately pivoted, and we looked at our backlog of actions. Do we still need these? Can we do them right now? You know, we got down to like 5 or something by the end of the hour because we'd actually just blitzed most of it, and that really empowered the team. We never got that bad ever again, which was a good thing.
All right, there's quite a bit left. I'm wondering if we need another episode
for the Scrum artifacts bay and the backlog and
2 backlogs in an increment, and the definition of done.
I'm just thinking that I'm not sure I want to rush through the rest of them so we can squeeze it into an episode, and also be careful of not making it too long. So perhaps it's more valuable to have it split so that we have 4 parts.